Hi class, welcome to Lecture 1, Part 2, The Elements of Art. So, in the first part of this lecture, we covered line, shape, form, and value. And in the second part of the lecture, we're going to cover the other three elements of art, which are color, space, and texture. So here's our definition of color. Color is produced when light waves strike an object and are reflected back into our eyes. Our modern understanding of light and color begins with Isaac Newton. In 1665, there was a great plague, which was an epidemic that started in London and quickly became a pandemic, if you can imagine what that's like. Newton was at Cambridge University, and he had just finished his bachelor's degree. The school closed down its doors in response to the plague, and Newton then withdrew to his childhood home, which was 60 miles away. That began what is called his Year of Wonders. And so because he was a nerd in quarantine, he did lots of science experiments. And in one of these experiments, he drilled a hole through a wooden door to let a small beam of light in and cast it through a prism. The light refracted and made a rainbow, also known as the visible spectrum of color. And the rest, we say, is history. So let's talk about color. Color is produced when light waves strike an object and are reflected back into our eyes. The sun's rays contain all the colors of the rainbow mixed together. This mixture is known as white light. So to see color, you have to have light. When light shines on an object, some colors bounce off the object and other colors are absorbed by it. Our eyes only see the colors that are bounced off or reflected. So let's say we have an apple and the sun is shining white light on that apple. The apple absorbs all the colors except the red light, and that is what gets reflected back into the viewer's eye. And that is the selective absorption of light. The absence of light is pure black. So when we're looking at something black, all of the colors of the rainbow are being absorbed by the object. And that's all for now on the science of color. It's not something that you're going to be quizzed on specifically, but I just wanted you to understand the general theory of it. So we've talked about what color is. Let's talk about its properties. Color consists of three properties. The first is hue. Hue is the given name to a color, such as red, yellow, blue, purple, green, orange, etc. Then there's also saturation, which is sometimes also called intensity or chroma, but I prefer saturation. In the digital world, that's the term that we use, and we're living in a digital age, so I think that makes more sense. So, saturation is the purity or dullness of a color. The most pure and vibrant colors come right from the tube. Colors that have been combined with various hues are thought to be less intense. So to reduce the intensity of a color, there are two options. There's the top option, which is you can mix the color with gray. And so you'll see we're picking red as our color, and then it's going down the scale to middle gray. And then in the lower color scale, we've mixed red with its complement, which is green, and we'll explain what that is later. And then you get these sort of like brownish hues in the center. And then the last property of color is value, which we've already talked about. Yay! So value is the lightness or darkness of a color. Adding white or black to a hue changes its value. A tint is created when white is added, and a shade is made when black is added. Color can be described as warm or cool. Our warm colors are red, orange, and yellow. They are typically bright and energetic. They can be angry, they can be happy, high energy emotions. And then we've got our cool colors, which are blue, indigo, and violet. And these colors are more calming, more subdued. They can be somber, maybe even mysterious. And then we also have the greens, which those kind of hang out in the middle. And it can go either way depending on its exact hue. So if it's a more turquoise or teal, then it could be described as cool. But if it's more of a lime yellow green, then you would describe it as a warm green. So let's look at the color wheel. We can use the color wheel as a guide to mix color, and there are certain color groups, which you probably know these already, the first of which is primary, red, yellow, and blue. Then we have the secondary group, which is orange, violet, and green. So these are the colors you get when you mix two primaries together. So blue and yellow make green, yellow and red make orange, etc. Then you have the third group, which is tertiary, and that's what happens when you mix a secondary color with its adjacent primary. Don't worry about writing that exact definition down. Just make sure that you understand the principle. There are more groups after that, but we're not going to go that deep into it. So there's also color schemes. The most basic one, and one which we've already covered, is monochromatic, and that means one color with varying tints and shades. An example that we saw was Mark Tansey's Reverb, which has a monochromatic scheme of Prussian blue. The next kind of color scheme is called complementary. Complementary colors are on opposite ends of the color wheel, and it doesn't mean complementary in the sense that they necessarily go well together. They do, but not more than any other colors. They're called complementary just because they're on opposite sides. And because they're on opposite sides, they have the greatest amount of contrast. Obviously, the most contrast you can have is black and white. But if you're working with color and you have red, the highest contrast with that is going to be green, orange with blue, and yellow with violet. And so just like with the other color scales we've seen, you can mix those two together. So in the first column, we see purple and yellow color scale, blue and orange color scale, and then green and red color scale. And you get these, when you mix a color with its complement, you get a range of neutral tones. And some of these, if you add white to them, you can get good skin colors. So we're back to Bridget Riley now. She's using turquoise and red together to create this vibrating, pulsing effect along with the wavy lines. And that's because of the contrast. Now, she's using a turquoise and a red that are a little desaturated. If she was using pure color, then you probably would not even be able to look at it. It would be way too intense. So that was complementary. Another kind of color scheme is analogous, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And I didn't do every combination here. I just did a couple. So let's look at a work of art that has analogous color schemes. These are homage to the square, soft-spoken, and this is part of a series by Joseph Albers. Joseph Albers was one of the most important teachers of the Bauhaus school. And Bauhaus was a German art and design movement that championed geometric, abstract styles, and there's little sentiment or emotion. Another example of analogous color schemes is this Van Gogh painting, Irises in a Vase. So we're going with blue and green next to each other. They don't have a lot of contrast because the colors are next to each other on the color wheel, and that kind of gives them a calming effect. So to recap, we have monochromatic, complementary, and analogous. There's also 3 more, but we don't need to dive into that. I just wanted to show you that there is more, but you don't need to write those down. One other type of color scheme is polychromatic. Poly meaning many and chroma meaning color. And these can be all over the place on the color wheel. So here we have another one by Chuck Close, and this painting is huge as well. There's no blending, it's just color and shape. And an interesting thing about this is that when he painted it, it was on the canvas was set at a 45-degree angle so that he could make that grid more easily. And then it was turned right ways when it was ready to hang. So that was color. Now we've got our 6th element, which is space. Space is the area around, above, and within an object. Positive space is where the shape exists and the area inside the shape. In other words, where we place the subject of the art. So in the case of Bridget Riley, the black is the positive space. And negative space is the area around and between positive spaces. So in the same example, the white is the negative space. There's a lot of optical illusions that play with positive and negative space. This one here is probably the most well-known. Depending on how you read the image, the positive space could be the 2 white faces, or it could be the black goblet or cup, if you will. This is M.C. Escher's Day and Night, where he's playing with negative space to juxtapose 2 ideas. And then as a side note, when we talk about space in sculpture, we're being literal. So for the example of Andy Goldsworthy's Touching North, the circles are the positive space, in other words, the object, and the hole in the center is the negative space, as well as all the space around the sculpture. Spaces can be classified into 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional space. 2-dimensional space is flat. It has a length and a width, but no thickness or height. And 3-dimensional space has depth, in other words, length, width, and height. So this is going back to when we were looking at shapes versus forms. Shapes are 2-dimensional, forms are 3-dimensional. And it's the same thing with space. Another way that we show space is with perspective. Perspective is the representation of 3-dimensional objects or spaces in 2-dimensional artworks. And that's called the picture plane. So when we're talking about the picture plane, we're talking about the paper or the canvas, whatever that like flat surface is. There are 2 kinds of perspective. The first is linear perspective. What we're looking at here is a diagram of linear perspective. We've got 3 cubes, and we know that in reality, all the sides of the cubes are equal and parallel. But when you use linear perspective, parallel lines converge at a vanishing point. As an artist, you get to choose where to put that vanishing point and where to put that horizon line. So with 1-point perspective, one of the sides of the cube is facing you. We'll go back and look for a second. Now that's all well and good, but what if you want the edge facing you? Then you need 2-point perspective, which has 2 vanishing points. If you want to take it to the extreme, you can use 3 vanishing points. This kind of perspective is used a lot in comic books. So let's look again at Mark Tansey's Reverb. We are up close with the subjects of the painting, so we don't see the whole room, but his strong use of perspective suggests that they're in a large room or perhaps a long hall. And so in this composition, the vanishing point is actually off to the side of the picture frame. So the other kind of perspective is called atmospheric perspective. This refers to the effect of the atmosphere has on the appearance of objects when you look at them from a distance. You see objects further back into the distance less clearly, and their color changes in value, saturation, and hue. As an artist, you can increase the mood and feeling in your work by exaggerating these effects in your painting. This creates a greater illusion of depth and distance and helps you to establish the mood and feeling of the landscape. So here we have some examples. These are all from Monet, and you can see how in all of them, the background is more blurry. The colors are a little less saturated. And then even though, if we're looking at the one on the bottom left, which has the boats, it's still very basic. There's not a lot of detail, but at least the boat is crisp. The green one in the foreground is crisp, whereas the blue ones in the background are kind of blurry. There are other ways to create the illusion of space as well. Take, for example, Picasso's 3 Musicians. Technically, there is space here. It's just very, very shallow. We're getting the sense of space from the overlapping mainly, but also some atmospheric perspective at work. The negative space is darker and more muted, whereas the positive spaces are more bright and saturated colors. Another way to create the illusion of space is difference in size. So here we have the Mona Lisa, and we know that she's close. We know that she's not a giant. We know that, she's big because she's right in front of us, and then the background is probably looking at a window or something like that. And then there's that atmospheric perspective making it like a little more blurry, a little less saturated. So size and atmospheric perspective working together. Another way to do it is using shading. When you add shading, you have to decide what the light source is going to be, where the light source is going to be coming from, so that you know where to put the highlights and shadows and midtones and all that stuff. Another method is placement. So let's take, for example, these spheres. They're all roughly the same size, but the ones toward the top seem farther away. And then last thing that can help creating the illusion of space is using warm versus cool colors. Warm colors tend to advance, cool colors tend to recede. So if we're looking at the top left, you can just look at the top 2 and see how the different colors are kind of like competing for which one is going to be more prominent. That purple is definitely like receding backward. That green is definitely hanging out in the middle. And then the bottom 2 squares, it's a simpler look at just one warm and one cool together. And we take the same composition and like flip the colors, and it changes like what you perceive as the positive space and the negative space. So there's a reason why stop signs are red and not purple. So they stand out. So when you're choosing colors for a landscape, for example, you might want to put the cooler colors in the background, the warmer colors in the foreground, and if you have any greens, put those somewhere in between, and that's going to help create the illusion of space for you. Okay, now we're at our final element of art, texture. Texture is the perceived surface quality of a work of art. It may be perceived physically through the sense of touch, or visually, or both. Here we're seeing the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The surface is so smooth that it reflects back the image of the viewer. And then there's a rough texture with the carved granite names that just invites you to touch it. And there's no color. Color is not doing any job here. The only color is the surrounding landscape. So there's 3 types of texture. There's physical texture, which is what you would feel if you touched the artwork. Light and shadow are important factors in the visual experience of physical texture, because the physical profile of the texture casts shadows that help us perceive the texture. So the visual experience of physical texture is also informed by what our previous experience is with the physical world. And so I'll go clockwise here. Clockwise from top left, we have a close-up of a Van Gogh painting. He uses a technique called impasto, where he puts dabs of paint on the canvas and it gives it that texture, and the colors are kind of mixed together that way. Top right, we have Winslow Homer, and this is a watercolor. And part of, when you do watercolor, part of what it's picking up is the texture of the paper. So that's what you're seeing. You can see it a lot in the clouds and on the water in the boat. Bottom left is Tar Beach. This is a wall hanging. It's a quilt. So it's kind of walking that line between 2D and 3D. But it's physically made of cloth. And then the piece in the center is painted cloth. So that has that physical texture. And then the bottom right is actually one of mine. I did a series of pieces that were made with cardboard, and you can see there's the corrugation in the cardboard. I'll do a bigger look so you can have more of a context of what the piece is. So you can see that, like, there's a series of gears, and there's the corrugation of the cardboard that makes the teeth of the gears, but then you can also see the corrugation that's like covered by like a thin sheet of brown paper. So there's also implied texture. Implied texture is the illusion or representation of physical texture. It's created by the manipulation of light and shadow to mimic the visual experience of physical texture. So going clockwise from top left, we've got Chuck Close's fingerprint painting, which kind of has a sandy texture. Edward Gorey, he's got a scratchy texture with the hatching. And then on the bottom left, we've got some stuff that looks like pebbles, rocks, maybe tree bark. And then on the bottom right, we have something that looks like a macro photo of fibers like yarn or something like that, like a knit sweater. So finally, the third type of texture, there's pattern. A pattern is a design in which lines, shapes, forms, or colors are repeated. The part that is repeated is called a motif. So patterns can be either regular or irregular. On the left, we're seeing Faith Ringgold's quilt again, Tar Beach, large-scale wall hanging. So in addition to the physical texture of the cloth, we also have the patterning in the different squares around the border of the quilts. If we look to the right at Picasso, there's some irregular patterning in the orange and yellow triangles in the harlequin suit. And on the beard of the man on the right, there's some regular stripes implying the texture of his beard. There's also some dashy lines on the dog that's underneath the table. All right, and I'm showing some more quilts by Faith Ringgold. I wanted to add these just because I think she's really cool, and it's a good example of pattern. Also, when I was a student, I had the pleasure of going to see one of her shows, and at the show, they had like a little like room off to the side where they were just playing a documentary, or sorry, an interview with her, and she was talking about how when she was in art school, how one of her teachers told her to just give it up, to give up art because she wasn't going to get anywhere as an artist, and she just didn't have like what it takes or whatever. And she didn't listen to him. She decided to do it anyway. And I think that that's really brave. I know when I was in school, the approval of my art teachers was really important to me. And if somebody had said to me, like, hey, kid, you don't have it, you don't got what it takes, I don't know what I would have done with that information. So respect to somebody who just goes ahead and does it anyway. And teachers don't know everything, they're not always right. And with that, we'll end part 2 of lecture 1. So there's one more lecture to go. All right, hope you enjoyed it.